Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Collision Live. It's me, your second favorite host, Daniel, joined at the desk, as I always am, by the disgusting syrup-covered sticky table to my Waffle House, Mr. Samuel David Camp. What is up?
Oh, not too much, Daniel. I think you're the favorite. You don't have to play second fiddle.
Scripture talks about don't elevate yourself. Allow the people to elevate you.
I'll elevate you. I'll elevate you.
Well, I won't.
I see what you did there. That's sneaky.
I won't stop you. I feel like you're still the people's champ. But hey, we're excited to have you guys join us. Another episode of the Collision Live. Just looking at a lot of interesting stuff going on this week. Pop culture. Yeah. Easter, we're going to get into that. Easter.
Just around the corner.
Just around the corner, a couple days. So get all those eggs ready, and obviously a lot more important stuff than just Easter bunnies and eggs. But a lot going on. One thing I wanted to share real quick before we get into our, kind of the main pop culture stuff in our show is that I actually have a book coming out today. I shared this a couple weeks ago, and I got my copy. The Experiencing God is a teen 8-week Bible study that my brother wrote. It was already kind of getting some traction. The #1 new release on Amazon for kind of youth ministry discipleship. That's out today, so it's kind of exciting. So hey, if you know some teenagers, you have a church that has a youth group, check it out. It's a good study, obviously based, on the message that my grandfather wrote in the adult Experiencing God Bible study.
And you and Mike did the videos for this as well.
We did. So we wrote the book. We flew out to Seattle, filmed some interesting videos, just talking about God and our relationship to Him. Filming on a boat, filming in a rainforest, filming downtown with some crazy people yelling at us and rain. And so it was a fun experience. But we're excited to have that book out. So I encourage you guys to check that out if you haven't. But we got a lot of stuff we want to talk about this week, so why don't we just jump right into it with our first segment, which we have pop culture news. So a lot of stuff going on in pop culture this week. Probably the big one, which just dropped like an hour ago, maybe. Stranger Things 4, the fourth season of the kind of hit Netflix show, just released its first trailer for the show. This thing's coming out in May, so it's really not that far away. And this trailer looks pretty cool, so excited for that. Will Smith, hey, the world just can't stop talking about the slap. Will Smith, we're just obsessed over this thing apparently. Just came out that, and following kind of the consequences of walking up on national TV and smacking a guy in the face, is that you're banned from the Academy Awards for the next 10 years. I don't know if that means you can't be nominated or how that works, or just can't attend the ceremony. I'm suspecting you won't get nominated after that. But again, this saga still continues to drag on. More news, upcoming Percy Jackson show, which I think will be an interesting one for Christians to navigate with. It deals with kind of Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and a bunch of other stuff. This show's coming up on Disney Plus. There were some movies, but this is a whole new thing. That just cast their lead actor, who's the kid from The Adam Project. Terrible movie, but good kid actor, so we'll see how that goes. Brie Larson was announced to join the cast of Fast and Furious 10. I don't care, other than the fact that this means we're getting Fast and Furious 10, which is one of the many problems we have in modern society. And a couple of things that just kind of the dumb news of the week. It's a two-parter. The first one is there's a new live-action Casper the Ghost series, which on its own is not a bad thing. I have some nostalgia for some Casper the Ghost, but this is the description for this that they released. This series will be a darker take that reimagines the origin of Casper in a coming-of-age story that explores what it means to be alive. Because everything has to be darker and more gritty, even old cute Casper the Ghost. But probably the dumbest news story that we've had, at least since that Wile E. Coyote, whatever was going on with that. Colin Trevorrow, the new Jurassic World Dominion, which comes out, I'm guessing in the summer, a couple of months, has been kind of making the news, talking about, kind of hype people up for the new movie. And apparently there's a new dinosaur called the Gigantosaurus. Take that as you want. And he's describing this dinosaur that he wants it to be like the Joker. It just wants to watch the world burn. And to me, that's kind of in a nutshell, in one sentence, describes why these new Jurassic Park movies are just awful. Just let dinosaurs be dinosaurs. But that's the end of my soapbox. And it's also the end of pop culture news. So Sam, are you looking forward to either a dark, gritty Casper the Ghost or a Gigantosaurus Joker-like character?
Well, I no to the Casper the Ghost. I am curious about Stranger Things 4. I just wonder how long before this gets to be old. Like with they're really milking the nostalgia of the late 80s.
Because speaking of old, like these kids are like grown-ups now. Like these, like,
I know, like
so they can't.
it's been
The
like what,
runway
5 or
is
6
short.
years since the
Yeah, I lost.
which I love. I mean, like I absolutely loved the first season of it. I thought
First
it was
season
great.
good. Second season had Sean Astin in it, so A plus plus.
Yeah.
You can't have enough Sean Astin in anything. Third season I kind of lost interest
Because I think
didn't care.
as these things go, because it's sort of like the mystery thing. It's like
It loses
you can
its-
only it's.
But
you can
there's
only
something
draw-
about that music. I don't know if you've seen, if
Oh,
you watched
yeah,
the
the
trailer. Yeah, like
trailers.
it pulls me in. Just that nostalgia.
That's some of the best,
Yeah, I'm a
theme
sucker
music.
for that kind of stuff. So I am excited for that. And really none of the other news, the Will Smith
Yeah.
stuff. I just think the fact that we're still, like, everyone's talking about this is a bigger issue with our society than the fact that
yeah.
Will Smith smacked a guy. Shouldn't have done it, but it's, we have bigger problems, so let's move on
Yeah.
and let Will Smith.
Let's talk about those Joker dinosaurs.
Yeah, because that's what we need. We need dinosaurs that think.
We need dinosaurs that are actually evil and
yeah.
not just dinosaurs that are hungry.
Because a normal T-Rex apparently was not scary enough. We need them to, like, have personalities and stuff, which is just some of the dumbest pop culture
Have
stuff.
an intent to watch the world burn.
So my excitement has plummeted in almost to the point of extinction. But to jump into our first kind of major topic, like I said, this is Easter season or Easter week or Easter day, depending on how we celebrate it. So I thought we could kind of talk about this. I actually just wrote which I'm sure I'll plug again at the end of the show, but I just wrote an article kind of digging into some of this and just sort of the relationship of, like, Hollywood and movies and just the stories we tell with the Easter season, and, like, how do we kind of deal with this in our movies? How do our movies and stuff, like, impact the way that we celebrate Easter and think about Easter, if at all? So why don't you read my profound article, so you are loaded up with insight and truth. But what do you think? Like, sort of Easter according to Hollywood, like. What's some of the relations?
After scraping all the profundity out of that article, I've got a few takeaways. I think one is just how and you've written about this before, we've talked about it before, but you could say how the Easter story is sort of infused in almost every sort of Hollywood story, and you get into it with the what's his name?
Campbell, yeah, Joseph Campbell.
Yeah, Joseph. I was going to say Duncan Campbell, but I think that was like a
Isn't
18th century preacher or something. But Joseph Campbell, sort of the hero's journey, that story arc, and sort of everything is kind of a retelling of the Easter story.
The monomyth that he called it. That it's kind of in part or in full, we're just telling one story over and over. And then there are issues with that theory, and I don't think he was necessarily totally right. But the point is, like, a lot of these tropes and stuff in movies and in any kind of story, like, repeats. Like, we're telling a lot of the same thing. We're drawn to a lot of the same things. And Campbell was sort of this weird, very, like, new agey spiritual, like, his conclusions that he took from all that was just kind of wild. Don't follow that kind of stuff. Very kind of self-seeking. But I think, like, his point is that these stories are reflective. And one of those things is, I think it's like the 10th step of the 12 of the hero's journey is, like, resurrection, like that we're kind of the one of the pinnacle moments in universally in stories is that these heroes kind of sacrifice themselves or die or however that works, and then they're either like physically reborn or like metaphorically reborn or come back to kind of save.
Rocky 4, I think, or Rocky 3, the big comeback,
which is a great underrated series, but yeah, so this because the thing is, like, and I kind of get into it in my article, is like, we don't really necessarily have a whole lot of Easter movies. Like, we have, like, we have, think of, like, Christmas, like, in contrast, like, Christmas is this whole season. There's
a whole, like, Christmas section, like, on Netflix, I think, like, because I remember we watched quite a bit because Kara was very pregnant with our second, and it was just like, let's just do happy things because she was super sick. And so it was like, there's a whole, like, Christmas section, Christmas genre of, like, films that you could probably watch them for like a month straight.
Like we ran out of time. Like, we were trying to watch one, like, every day leading up to Christmas, and, like, we didn't even get to finish the Muppet Christmas Carol, which is the best of all of them. Like, there's tons. Like, we tell lots of those stories, and we don't have that for Easter. Now we'll get into maybe in a second. Like, we do have, like, the more like crucifixion with a little resurrection thrown in there at the end of it in the end credits scene. But I think we do. So although we don't have, like, a whole lot of those, like, Easter season movies, like, this, like, the resurrection though is permeates so much of, like, because, like, kind of Joseph Campbell's thing, you can, like it doesn't take much to think of like, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Harry Potter does that, like Batman and so different scenes. In my article, I even I listed like Spider-Man from like the original Spider-Man, where it's very much like symbolic, where he's stopping the train and his arms are outstretched, and it's kind of the crucifixion, and then he's kind of raised back up to be the savior of New York or whatever city he's in. So we have that, which I just think is interesting, like why that, even like, in films that sometimes those are like I think like the Spider-Man one is like it's intentionally trying just to sort of borrow some like biblical imagery to to add meaning, but I don't think they're all that way. Like I think this is sort of this natural thing that comes out in stories. Like
well, I mean, I think there is something to that, and it's just sort of this just ancient, I don't know, this ancient story or need for humanity to sort of like almost every good story follows that sort of trajectory, and like there's something about us that love like a good comeback story, but also like a good resurrection story. In varying degrees of resurrection, whether it's just sort of, they got beaten down and they're not dead and came back to life, but like they went away for a while, studied under a master, and then they came back to like save the village or whatever. And so I think there is something really like sort of deep within humanity that craves and is drawn to that idea of resurrection, the idea of sort of coming back despite all the odds and against great difficulty, and you're able to come back and fulfill the destiny or because
like the whole hero's journey thing, like like Campbell was not a Orthodox Bible believing Christian. He sort of he lumped Jesus in as like one of the tellings of that story, but like the way I kind of buy into some of the theory, and I think it's because it reflects the gospel story that like almost in like some weird or like unfathomable like spiritual way that like we're just wired to like understand the world through the gospel, whether we like do it separated as far as we can from like the actual gospel and like add to it, or it's not like everything's a perfect gospel story, but you just sort of see the gospel like influencing almost all of our stories. And I think the resurrection is one that definitely is a common theme throughout, even if we don't necessarily have like many like biblical themed ones, but we do have, because that's the other part of this is like I think the theme of resurrection is like lots of places and lots of heroes, but like there are also like the actual resurrection of Jesus as the story, like it's been done multiple times, like the Mel Gibson's the Passion of the Christ is like the most famous example of that. It's kind of the irony. There's like the most successful R-rated movie of all time is about Jesus. A lot of Christians breaking that rule that they have growing up to go see that movie. But what do you take from that movie? I don't know when the last time you actually saw The Passion was. Like, I know some people watch it.
Whenever it came out, I think was probably the last time I just saw it. I think once. But yeah, it's those sort of things are tough because you can and I think that, Mel Gibson and crew do a great job of sort of depicting the physical tortures that Christ went through. But again, that's still just sort of a shadow of the actual suffering that he endured. And it's always tough. Like, I think any sort of film that's sort of an adaptation of scripture is always going to be tricky. Like, and I think it's always going to be hard to like really nail down what was it like, and obviously I don't think any of them will be like 100% accurate, and you just can't be because we weren't there. But again, I think like you said in the article, just that sort of emphasis on the physical pain is probably the closest sort of analog that we can get to like what was that actually like. I mean, I think death on a cross is horrific, and maybe it was sort of the best depiction of the actual suffering that Christ was going through by taking the sin of the world. The closest thing we have at this time in history is a cross. Like, everybody gets that's excruciatingly painful, and like that's just a shadow of the actual.
Yeah, and I think kind of one of my even just issues. I don't know, issues. That makes me sound like I'm just some cranky person. But like one of the things that with like
let it out, Daniel. It's okay.
It's time. Like with the Passion movie and stuff. Like why I just like I remember seeing that it was like everyone's like every Christian's Christian duty to like make pilgrimage to the AMC theater and like see it when it first came out. And like I remember like afterwards like leaving the theater and like not really wanting to like talk about it, and it wasn't because like, I was just so moved, and I was like oddly unmoved by it, and like I felt guilty that like that I wasn't more emotional, that it wasn't more impactful, and like I think like, it took me a while to like figure out exactly why that is, but like I think part of like, my problems with like some of these depictions of like it's more Good Friday movies than it is even Easter movies.
Yeah.
You almost always get the crucifixion and then very little of like the joyful part. But it is like it's very much like it's the R-rated movie. Like it's very much the physical kind of suffering and like very much going hard into that. And like I think that even just is reflected in like a lot of this churches and stuff. Like a lot of pastors and stuff. Like we're just very much kind of almost in like exaggerated terms. They're just like, no one's ever suffered more physical pain, and like the cross is just the worst thing that could ever happen, and like it was a horrible death, but like almost like leaning into that, but missing like the real power of the crucifixion, which is like the verse that can't, at least to me, like, be depicted cinematically. You have 2 Corinthians 5:21 where it says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And like the spiritual aspect of like the crucifixion is, I think, missed a lot of times in trying to like just sort of hype up just how much pain and like physical, and like, cause like the reality is like, I think there are many Christian martyrs that like have suffered more physically painful deaths than Jesus did.
There's some horrendous ways to go.
Yeah, like there's, like, I wouldn't want to be crucified, but like there are horrible, impaled on poles and skinned alive and burnt, and like there are tons of painful ways, and like that's not really the point of like that Jesus just went through that. Like I feel like I would suffer physical pain for my kids, but like I wouldn't be able to bear the sins of the world, and like I think that is one of the limitations of like Easter and like. Because Christmas, you can almost show it more like it's obviously still a lot of spiritual stuff going on, but like you can depict that story in a way that still like captures the joy and like the coming and like the wonder. Where like I feel like Easter and like the crucifixion, like it's just hard to capture what's actually happening. Other than just sort of trying to give a lot of violence and like almost shock people into.
Well, I think that's the thing. I mean, I feel like even still, all these years later, like. Really the closest thing that we can try to depict that relates the agony that he went through on a spiritual level is that crucifixion. And so I think it's sort of that shortcut maybe that we try and do to sort of show that like it was a really, really bad experience for him, and it was a horrible death. And so I think because it's so, I mean, how do you depict the sins of the world on one person? Like you can't, and it's probably even impossible to fathom. And so like, well, the next best thing is like it was a horrible death too, and so that sort of is a sort of a stand-in for just how bad it was. But again, it is in some ways a disservice to what was the real trauma of that event wasn't just the way that he died, but it was taking on the sins of the world, and that's something that I don't think is possible.
Yeah, and this is one of like the shortcomings, like the double-edged sword for like just like movies and like the benefit. Like I think either the more secular versions of like resurrected heroes, which just sort of give like a glimmer, like a reflection of like the gospel story, or like whether it's the actual Jesus is the actual character in the story. Like I think those are helpful for us like as Christians to like just be reminded about sort of what happened, but like they're not a stand-in for that. Like I think we also need to be careful that we're not like basing our view of the resurrection and the crucifixion like just on like the passion of the Christ, or like I think that will lead us to having a very kind of earthly, almost like diminished view of like the actual spiritual stuff that was going on. But let us know if you guys, were you more moved by the movie than I am, or like, are there some other crucifixion or Easter movies? It is funny that we tend to always make movies about the crucifixion, but like because even like Mel Gibson, like I think like the very end of it ends with like the tomb open, but like. I feel like sort of the joyful, like the real power of the story, like the resurrection, almost is like we just sort of throw that in, but we want to just focus on the death, which just seems kind of a bizarre thing to do. But hey, let us know what you guys think. Any kind of Easter movies or things that are meaningful for you in this as the day approaches, Easter Sunday comes. But another thing that I know I am personally very interested in, and that is this week's Host Corner.
All right, so this week, Daniel, you may not have known this, and our viewers may not have known this, but I was a bit of in the words of Avril Lavigne, a skater boy back in the day in my younger years when I could still move flexibly. I was not a good skateboarder, but I loved it, and it was a lot of fun, and I played a lot of Tony Hawk Pro Skater. And so I was excited to see, and I watched this over the weekend, the new Tony Hawk documentary, Until the Wheels Fall Off. And I would recommend it, with the caveat that, as is often the case in skate culture, there is some language, and so be aware of that. But I think it's a really fascinating look at sort of one of the greatest skateboarders of all time. And I think the thing I love about skateboarding is the artistry, and I think it was Rodney Mullen, who's also in the documentary, talks about this, but I think skateboarding is maybe perhaps one of the greatest sort of artistic endeavors of our time. And with that, I'll stop. But it's a great film, super nostalgic, and it's kind of heartbreaking too. Just with it gets into some of Tony Hawk's story and sort of how he came to be who he is today. So.
Well, I don't know how. I think I knew that you had told me before that you were a skater. But was that a BOI skater boy, or just?
No, just
no.
Yeah.
But hey,
we built like rails and ramps and stuff in our driveway, and so it was pretty fun. But I was terrible at it.
Hey, I was Tony Hawk skater on like the N64. Woo! I could do some tricks. I was I vicariously living out my ability that I was not coordinated enough to do on my own.
I think the amazing thing about it is like he's in his 50s now, and like just the longevity of someone in a sport that's so physically demanding is to me pretty impressive.
Yeah, and he's still. I think is he not like officially retired? Because he competed not long ago.
I think so.
He's the man, Tony Hawk,
the GOAT.
But you mentioned language. Speaking of language and profanity, that leads us right into our next topic of our show: R-rated faith-based films. This might seem like a weird. Just the title itself almost seems like an oxymoron. So I wanted to get into that because this is actually inspired by several things. One is there's a new movie coming out in 2 days, I think. Mark Wahlberg, Father Stu. Some of you guys may be familiar if you've been seeing. They've been previewing this in front of movies and theaters and stuff, where he's sort of based on a true story, where he's playing like a boxer that is very a man of the world, and then he I think he has like a car wreck or something, an illness, and he's dying and he's in a bad place, and like kind of becomes a priest, and kind of sort of his story as sort of this like kind of this redemption story. Which is fallen, but this is a movie that is rated R, and it's a movie that I have not seen it because it's not out yet. But hopefully, we'll have a review for the Collision on that. But it, from all that we've seen and the interviews and stuff, like it's rated R because there's violence and there's profanity. There's I don't know how hard enough to be rated R.
If you know anything about Mark Wahlberg, I think. I don't know that he's in many films without profanity.
He's a man that definitely knows his way around some cuss words. But he is his story. If you guys haven't really followed some of it, like he's Catholic, I think. But he's been very on like a faith journey and open about his faith and some of the mistakes he's made in the past. And but it is so I wanted to kind of get into that because it's like because he even calls it this is a faith-based film. Like he's even using like kind of like the real churchy, like he's not like trying to beat around the bush. Like this is sort of like very much inspired by faith and his faith, and he hopes it's a tool to lead people to Jesus, and so it's, he's not being like wishy-washy about that. And there's another one we can get into both these. So that's the main one, but a movie that came out. I forget when it came out, earlier this year or at the very end of last year, Redeeming Love, which is based on a kind of a romance novel that I know kind of blew up in kind of the Christian circles a while ago. That's dealing with some kind of mature stuff, kind of a modern or more modern retelling of the book of Hosea. And this movie came out and it also kind of got some heat, and we just didn't end up talking about it on the Collision. So now we have our chance because this is a movie that it was another kind of faith-based Christian movie based on a Christian book, but it had sex scenes, it had kind of partial nudity, it had mature content, kind of dealing with that. And I know there was a a lot of discussion kind of on that. So kind of using both these movies, I know there's more examples we could use, but kind of the larger topic of is like, is there a place for that? Like, like, I think most of us have in mind like faith-based films are very extremely sanitized.
Yeah.
And, like, we go to those movies almost like a lot of people watch them, choose them because there isn't that stuff.
Yeah.
That's why they, and the story and all that stuff almost comes second, but because it's safe. But I guess there's a place for like telling more. Is that like an oxymoron? Like, can Christians like wrestle with more and like depict things more like I hate the word mature because that's like the worldly way of speaking about it. I don't think sin is necessarily mature, but it's just like more like gritty, I guess is a better word. Like, what do you think? Like,
more explicit, maybe.
Explicit. That's better than as though like once you mature enough, then you can watch more sex. That's not what we're trying to say. But what do you think? Obviously we haven't seen. We haven't seen the Father Stu movie.
No, but I was really interested in this because again, it's that idea of like, I mean, I think it's probably going to be a really good movie. One, because of the folks that are in it, but two, because it's going to be sort of true maybe to the story. And I mean, again, I think we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but I think partly it depends on the explicitity of it. Like, what is being explicit, right? Like, is it, I think sort of the sex and nudity is maybe a category to its own versus hard language and violence. So I think for a lot of Christians, the language and the violence I think there maybe are some places for that. Like, I think for a lot of people, they would maybe point to something like Saving Private Ryan, like as sort of, I mean, it's not faith-based, but it's a movie that is sort of true to what it was like to land on the beaches of Normandy. And like, not to pick on Sherwood, but like if Sherwood had made that film, it would have felt like a nice like Sunday morning.
Yeah, you wouldn't
stroll,
have
like
the language, you wouldn't have the violence. Like, it would
so it'd be a really sort of sanitized version of events, which is less powerful overall. But I think I think it can be. It's a tricky line. Like, and I think for the viewers, I think everyone's going to draw those lines in sort of different places as well. And so I think that's what makes it kind of this awkward place of like, so what do you do with this movie? Because I can imagine, though, too, someone watching something like Father Stu and, years down the road, maybe pointing back to that movie and saying, well, that's actually what began my faith journey. And it was because I'm a huge Mark Wahlberg fan, and so I watch all of his movies, and I watched this one. It really resonated and began these questions in me. And so you can see where a movie like that, that person would never watch like anything coming out of sort of the sterilized, faith-based industry. Could have an impact.
Yeah, and I do think like, and the crazy thing too is like Wahlberg like financed this thing like personally. Like, this is very much a story that he wanted to tell, and kind of a meaningful one. And I do think because even the way I kind of phrased our question, like I think there is also a distinction to me between like, should all Christian movies be raw with profanity, and like, is there a place for like, I think I don't necessarily want every Christian film to have profanity, or like most of them don't need it. But sort of the more nuanced question, I guess, is like, is there places for stories?
Yeah.
Or is that somehow a sin to? And part of the again, I haven't seen this movie to know how it does, but I was blown away. I shared it actually on Twitter, which I just thought was interesting because like part of like some of the questions like Wahlberg in interviews about why this is an R-rated film if it's supposed to be like for faithful people and stuff, and like his answers are just sort of like, hey, because it's real. Like, this is a true story. This is how people talked. Like, the whole story of Father Stu is a guy that was very of the world and kind of very rough person, and like the power of the film is the contrast between like where God brought him to. And it's interesting because like I've watched kind of an interview on that, and then like the next article I find, I think it was in like The Guardian. I don't know if it's original to The Guardian or if they just like aggregated it, but it's this article that's the author's just like reeling into Wahlberg and Mel Gibson, who's also in this movie, kind of saying and this movie's gonna be awful. Like, there's no place. Like, how dare these two guys that have had like a bunch of bad stuff in their past, and you know, a lot of stuff that we all know that they've done, and like horrible stuff, like, you know, in you know, things they've said and done. Like, how dare they think that they can like play these characters that get redeemed? Like, doesn't that seem so you know, self-serving and all this stuff? And I just thought it's just this contrast of like, you know, in like a world that's so like graceless and like,
Yeah.
like, you can't even have like actors play fictional characters that are redeemed.
Well, I mean, I think that goes to just this sort of idiotic mindset. I think that's somewhat pervasive, but maybe less so than we think, is that idea that like only people who exactly identify as the character they're playing can play that character. And it's like, well, that's no longer acting. Like, it's like, oh, well, you have to have like this kind of person play this kind of character. It's like, well, then it's not acting. Like, if you want that, then like go watch like reality TV or something.
Yeah, the idea that they can play a
like,
character to be redeemed is this.
It's just, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, on the one level, like, you know, it's a movie, but it also sort of brought home to me too, like, you know, that's, I think, whether you agree or not, or whether you feel like appropriate for the movie, but like, I think that's almost why, in Wahlberg's sense, like, he wants to show it raw, to show that, like, not that he just wants, like, it's about redeeming himself, but like, to show, like, you know, like, I think a lot of, it was, we've talked about before, like, a lot of like faith-based films, like, you have like naughty characters that are redeemed. Like, you don't really have like bad people, because I think a lot of times we feel restricted by how far we can show sin, because we don't want to like vicariously sin by showing it on screen. So I think you know, for Wahlberg, it's like, hey, show life as it is. Like, this is who we want to show. God can redeem anyone, and we want to sort of give a whole picture of sin. You know, I don't think it's like endorsing that. Like, I think the whole point is it's not endorsing that. But like you said, I think there is, and it's one of those areas that I don't necessarily know if I can like articulate exactly why, but like some like the redeeming love stuff, like when you kind of get into more of the like sexuality and stuff, is that seems different than like the profanity. Like, can you tell that story? And I think like some of the like because the author of the book also like kind of wrote the screenplay and was very involved in the movie. So some of like her interviews and stuff, like, I think the case she makes is an interesting one, saying like, hey, the Bible has like Song of Solomon, like, this is like erotic love poetry, and like God put that in the Bible, like, you know, like within marriage, like sex, like Christians are kind of, in her mind, like, you know, we've lost a sense of like the beauty of some of that stuff, like in its proper context, because we're so removed and don't want to ever deal with sex or anything. Like, so I think she's trying to kind of like address that a bit and say, hey, you know, these are good things, like, just because they are abused. But it's just sort of like, how do you, that line you go between like showing that without also just sort of making it very like trying to kind of stimulate and like, you know, just sort of be, you know, to cause sin or to cause people down the path or something. Like, I don't know. It just seems like, can you tell those without like showing skin or having a sex scene? Like, 'cause, like, the Bible has like, there's crazy sexual stuff in the Bible, like, and it's shown as sin. Like, you know, you have like incest and like, you know, in the cave with two different dogs. There's weird stuff. But there's this thing about like depicting that.
I mean, several things. I mean, I think seeing it written, I think, is different than seeing it depicted on screen. I think those are two. Like, I think those are differences. And then I think that area is, I think, trickier to navigate than, say, language or violence. And so I don't have a necessarily a good answer for like where do you thread that needle. But I mean, there are ways, I think, to get points across without necessarily sort of, you know, going all the way in all these different areas. And so I think, and again, I mean, even with the language, you can say certain things or imply certain things, or the violence, you can imply certain violence, I think, that's sort of off screen, but you know what this person is doing or what happened. So I don't know. And you know, how much of that should be on screen, how much should be off screen or just implied? Like I don't have a good answer for that.
Yeah. And I think it was one of the reasons why I like pop culture, I like the arts, is because, you know, like I said before, because it's not an area of like our life that's usually has easy, like, yes, no, like if like anytime it's that simple, then then I think we're just not thinking deeply enough about it. So I do think it is sort of like a case by case thing, and like, I think, I don't think you can necessarily just draw the line and just sort of, one size fits all. But I do think, like, in general, like, the Bible is such like a raw, it's almost like shows people at their best. It shows people at their worst.
Yeah.
It doesn't hold back.
It's definitely unfiltered, like, in its content.
It's sort of the irony that and I know other people have said it too. There's like, you couldn't film an accurate like depiction of the Bible, and churches wouldn't allow it to be shown.
Yeah,
Which is the irony. It's like, it's the Bible, but it's so raw, and like because of our standards of like entertainment and stuff, and like movies, like, so we can't watch it. But that's what we base like our life on. So I do think that like the Bible is sort of our example that like we should, as Christians, like the stories we tell and like how we navigate stuff, like it should be honest. Like it should be. And I think we almost approach a lot of our entertainment or movies like from the other extreme of like, the reason we're making this is because the world's so bad and there's so much stuff out there.
Yeah.
We want to sort of be a place
antidote.
where we don't have to deal with that.
Yeah.
Which is very not like the Bible stories and stuff. Like, it's very much the world and what's going on.
Well, and we don't have time to get into this today, but maybe another time. But even if you look at sort of the cathedrals in old Europe, those are all, they graphically tell the stories of Scripture, like the Duomo in Milan. Like, you can visually see the entire Bible depicted along the outside of it in like sculptural 3D form, and like, you better believe there's some like violent scenes and that kind of stuff that are depicted, and even like old stained glass and like, Renaissance Christian art is like not acceptable in like today's church. And so I do think there's just some interesting things that we could get into that, but probably another time.
Yeah, and I think you can kind of trace throughout history that, obviously like cinema didn't exist back then, but like the Christians and stuff have like navigated this issue differently of like, how do you depict things and how do you kind of what's appropriate for like, to put on the wall of a church or whatnot. But I do think it is a question that that Christians need to kind of wrestle through. And like, again, like I said, I don't think it needs to be like a template or all movies should be like this. But I do think there is a place for films that deal with like spiritual themes and, told by, faithful believers that deal with, like, I don't think a Christian is sinning to watch like a movie that's depicting like, the depths of sin and like there's profanity being spoken, or like, if you are surrounded, immersed in that, and like it leads you to start, walking around and just cussing when you stub your toe, like, then you need to be careful with that.
Yeah.
But just the idea that like a sin is happening, like, I don't think that's like vicariously sinning.
Yeah.
The whole point is to kind of to expose like the sin. So I'm excited for this movie because it's Easter weekend. I'm not exactly sure when I'll see it, but I am planning on seeing it just because, someone that's sometimes cranky about these faith-based films, this looked like one that maybe is different, that looks more like an actual movie that's not just trying to preach. And who knows, maybe it'll be awful. I like Mark Wahlberg; he's a good actor, so I'll probably be checking that out in the next bit. But let us know what you guys think. Are you guys, do you draw that hard line if it's R-rated, then it's not for Christians, or like, is there a place, and do you distinguish between like kind of what leads to the rating with the sex and some of that stuff, or as opposed to maybe violence or more just mature topics, or however we do that? We'd love to have that conversation. It's definitely a needed one, but also a messy one, so we can get into that.
Yeah.
But to end off our show this week at The Collision, I got several things kind of going on here. I encourage you to check out, we got some new movie reviews. We did a review for Sonic the Hedgehog 2, which wasn't as horrible and atrocious as the first one. Actually, pretty good movie.
So it's slightly above ground level.
Yeah, I think I gave it like 3.5 stars. I'm not don't think it's the best movie I ever made, but it is. It's a fine movie. And Morbius, which is not a good movie, we got a review for that, so check that out. Also have an article that just dropped yesterday on kind of Hollywood and the resurrection. Kind of get into some of the stuff we talked about today, but also kind of go in some different areas. So I encourage you to check that out as well on thecollision.org. Got my new book. Make sure you check that out. Go Google it. Find it on Amazon. Experiencing God, Student Edition, Teen Bible Study. But anything else going on this week for
I think that's it.
So thanks for joining us, guys. And we kind of challenge you. make Easter kind of a priority this week. Don't let it just sort of be that thing that you wake up on Sunday and remember you got to put on your nicer shirt before church. Let it be something that you kind of really do embrace and kind of wrestle with what all happened on the cross and through the empty tomb. Because this as Christians, this should be our week. This should be our big day. So let's make it that way. But thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.